All right, I think we're going to get started here. As my dad always says, if you're on time, you're late. So we're going to be on time, meaning let's start this thing. For a lot of reasons, because we have a lot to share today. Welcome to Nordic Northwest, velkommen, as I should say, actually, instead. My name is Edward Running. I am a member of the board of directors here at Nordic Northwest. And so I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers today. For those that don't know, Nordic Northwest is the home for discovering Nordic culture and ideas for the enjoyment and enrichment of the Pacific Northwest community. So this ties in really beautifully with some of the things we are striving to do here. The exhibit that is outside in our lobby, the Bolle Laboratorium, which is also understood as a housing lab, came to us as a sponsorship from the Scandesign Foundation in conjunction with the Danish Embassy. And the housing lab was originally created as part of an exhibit from 2023, an architectural congress in Copenhagen. And then we've had the pleasure of having the exhibit here. That has then kickstarted this idea of having an opportunity to talk about what we're doing here in the Pacific Northwest, in our own backyard and around our area, because of course, affordable housing, sustainability, community, building community, strong community is important to us here as well. And so we can learn from what those folks are doing over in Europe, but we also have a strong tradition here where we're challenging those ideas. So it's my pleasure to introduce first our moderator is from another partnership here from Nordic Northwest with World Oregon, which is connected to the World Affairs Council, who in many ways have actually very similar mission that we do. So Tim DeRoche is here. He's a program director there. For those that don't know World Oregon, their mission is to broaden and deepen public awareness, engagement, and understanding of international affairs, engage Oregonians with the world and with each other. World Oregon programs keep Oregonians connected to people, places, and ideas that are shaping and shared globally in the future. So I think that's a pretty nice tie-in to what we're talking about today as well. Our first panelist who's going to help us sort of share what's going on in our world is a person that's really important to the inner workings of the city of Beaverton, but beyond. So it's my pleasure to welcome Lacey Beaty here, the mayor of Beaverton. She is a dynamic leader with a deep commitment to public service, equity, and community building. Elected as the first female mayor of Beaverton in 2020, since she has made significant strides in improving housing affordability, enhancing veteran services, and creating more bikeable and workable city here for us. As a U.S. Army veteran who served in the Iraq War, Mayor Beaty has used her platform to advocate strongly for veteran causes, both state and national levels. Her leadership was crucial in the passage of Oregon's HB 2295, which prioritizes veteran-owned businesses in state contracting, and her advocacy led to impactful changes in HUD rules regarding housing and vouchers for veterans. In addition to her leadership on the city issues, Mayor Beaty's personal journey from veteran to public servant demonstrates her unwavering commitment to service. She continues to engage in the community in key initiatives, from expanding affordable housing to ensuring that people struggling with homelessness can live in a life of dignity. So with that, I welcome Tim and Lacey.
Thanks, Edward. As we get to Q&A, just as a note, our honorable mayor does have a city council meeting and may have to bust out of here before you get all the questions answered. But we do have a mic here, so Edward, perhaps during Q&A, the mic on the far right, you could run that around to folks, and we can get as many questions as we can fit in. Mayor, thanks for joining us.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
One of the reasons that we wanted to invite you was this exhibit on the Danish Housing Lab is really looking at question, and when you said connecting Oregonians to the world and the world to Oregon, is something that we're very, very interested in, which is what do we learn, what do we import, what do we export in terms of ideas? And so how do we create housing that addresses some of the big challenges we have, whether that's an inventory of affordable housing, whether it's climate, new family patterns and migration, income inequality, gentrification and displacement. These are all things that are not only happening in our own backyard, but around the world. So if we sit and ask questions better and we listen better, hopefully we might find little things that help us with that challenge. So Mayor, you have been huge on housing as a key issue. And a couple things that come to mind, as I read about a lot of your accomplishments. One is you built the first emergency shelter in Beaverton with no cost to taxpayers, which, as someone who lives in Portland, but the other piece of this is housing. I believe is something that is very personal for you. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how this really became a front and center issue for you.
No, I appreciate that. First, thank you for welcoming me into your guys' home and your culture, and you're doing this. Maybe not so much a secret anymore, but this is mine and my husband's secret date place that we come to because we love the turmeric lattes in the cafe next door. So we have secret time over here. So if you see me, say hello, but he'll kill me for making our one incognito place maybe not so incognito anymore. I was raised by a single mom. Housing instability was something we experienced quite a bit. And one of the main reasons I joined the Army is I didn't have a pathway to college. And I really thought, when I joined the Army, I go to college, drink some beer. I wanted to be stationed in Germany, and I got that in my contract. And I met my husband in a parking lot of a hockey game in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And as Army people do, we got married very young, moved to Germany, had this great life. But my husband was one of the very statistical couch surfing homeless teenagers here in Oregon. And he joined the Army for very similar, to escape poverty, get college money. And it was something, if you experience housing instability, it is something, or homelessness, it is something deeply personal to young people that they try really hard to protect and not talk about. And on about the 20th anniversary of my husband basically coming out of poverty around his 40th birthday, we sat in the basement of City Hall when I was a baby city councilor and brought Washington County's first family shelter to Beaverton, Family Promise. And my husband and I said, how long does it take in the rest of the country? And they said a year. We're like, we're going to find space in 6 months. And so my husband joined that board. Family Promise operated. We were the first government in the country to host families for 2 weeks at a time in building we owned. And the Family Promise model accessed churches. And so you go to a church for 2 weeks. It's for families. They take care of you and feed you. And then 2 weeks later, you move to another church. And we also made one of the city spaces a host site. We're the first to do that. And when I became mayor in 2020, when I started running for mayor in 2019, everything was really awesome until February. And then I was like, oh shit, what did I get, what did I get myself into? I didn't realize how much I would have to talk about homelessness, how much I would have to talk about housing when I started running as a really young, full of energy 2019 mayoral candidate. Homelessness has been by far the #1 issue that Beaverton has faced. And when I took office, we had no homeless strategy, no plan. And within 6 months, we executed a strategy and then really started the idea that we needed to build a shelter. So we raised $15 million through various sources, federal earmarks, ARPA money, outside investors. I was committed to our community that none of that money would come from taxpayers. I negotiated with the county to operate it, and we got it done in a record speed of time. Now, if you are the church next to the temporary shelter, you think we took forever to build the homeless shelter. But I would say the first in the county, first to open its doors, and we're at functional zero. We're the first major city to do that. And I led that charge through dignity, because when I looked at people, I thought about my husband. And it's really easy to other people that are experiencing that. My husband has a doctorate in education, and unless he told you his story, you would probably not know that. And so I challenge our council and our community often to think about people and see someone like my husband, because that's really what we're talking about. So that's why I focus so much on homelessness and focus so much on housing. Housing is a spectrum we have to address.
And you're on the U.S. Conference of Mayors Housing Task Force.
Yeah.
How did that happen? And I'm curious, in this role, are you exporting ideas from here, there, or are there things you're seeing that you think are replicable or scalable here?
Well, I think the reason I got onto the task force is because I wouldn't shut up about the HUD problem that veterans were facing. And so a lot of veterans were accessing HUD-vouchers, vouchers for housing that were designed for homeless or very low-income veterans. In the government's divine wisdom, they were using veteran medical disability pay as income and excluding veterans from the housing that was built for them. And so veterans were making this decision between health care, I'm talking like $1,700 a month check on top, and like giving it up to have housing. And I just thought, we can do better. As a disabled veteran, when we bought our home, the government doesn't count that money as income towards housing unless you're homeless, and then they use it to exclude you from housing. So I really advocated, me and the mayor of LA, who used to be a member of Congress, we fought really hard with HUD in trying to figure out the path, and they reversed that rule last year. And it opened the door to over 20,000 veterans in this country to be able to access housing that was designed and built for them and get the wraparound services they need to heal and be, contributing members of society. So when Gunther, the mayor, the conference president, asked me to join the task force, it was through that tenacity of like, I know that you won't give up on what you want. And here's the reality. I don't share the political party with the current president. Anyone that knows me knows that for certain. But I can't ignore the federal administration. We need housing. We need these services. And so I agreed as a very liberal West Coast mayor to join the conference in tandem with 20 other mayors to talk about housing with the Trump administration, because we can't afford not to.
Well, so I was reading the housing needs analysis of Beaverton report, as I'm sure all of you have.
Yeah,
right?
I'll email it. Don't worry, it's great late night reading.
But I mean, key in that is the focus on equitable housing. And you talk in there a lot about, it is stated policy, which I think is really bold, to talk about people who have faced historic and ongoing disadvantages due to systemic issues. So can you talk about priority populations? Because that was something that you really call out in that report.
We used to do this housing tour, Portland housing tour, years ago. I got on a bus and we drove around Portland and learned about historic redlining, up until the 1940s.
The Fair Housing Council.
The Fair Housing Council. And it was really eye-opening. I'm Greek. My family immigrated here from Greece, and like seeing your own family on the list of, my dad couldn't even own a house here before the 70s. And so really thinking about when we look at the population and what Oregon looks like, there was a lot of people excluded from the ability to purchase a home. It was in the 2000s that removed racist language from housing contracts that you were signing. And so we're all old enough to remember when this wasn't allowed in Portland, but we're easy to forget if we don't keep it front and center. So we think a lot about that. Beaverton is the most diverse city in the Northwest. 1 in 5 people were born outside the United States. 1 in 3 speak a language other than English at home, and really thinking about prioritizing differently. And those populations change. I will tell you right now, one of the populations that we are high focused on because we've done a terrible job at is aging in place gracefully and creating spaces for senior citizens to live. And I did my graduate work on generational differences in the workplace. And so when I ran for mayor, I talked about the need for senior housing because the neighborhood I lived in downtown Beaverton, all of the neighbors around us were widowed women in their 70s. And I'm like, well, man, you guys live in like 5-bedroom houses. Like, what are you doing here? But the reality was it was paid off. And if they sold their house and entered the volatile housing market, where were they going to go? And it was cheaper for them to stay in their home. And I thought, why aren't we looking at housing as a spectrum? And why aren't we building for what our seniors need? Like one-story, cottage clusters, close into resources, and really putting seniors at the heart of our community. So our 6th affordable housing project in downtown Beaverton is senior-focused.
Well, and so what is so interesting about the Danish Housing Lab is they are embracing the changing dynamics and the changing family pattern structure. Yeah. And if any of you have not read the panels, there are 37 family patterns, which include children. There are also 6 other patterns that the Danish government consider in terms of thinking demographically of what defines a family. So we're not just talking about mom and dad and a kid in a single-family house. And so in response to that, and Sergio and I were talking earlier about this, recognizing that diversity and that change of influx and migration and how that's affecting things, that affects education, it affects planning, it affects house building, it has an effect on everything because it is embracing change, which we all know is very, very, very hard to embrace, and it gives people whiplash a lot of the time. But I think what's interesting, too, is the richness of the immigrant and refugee population, which is very multi-generational. Yep. So I see instead of using these changing dynamics as deficits, you are embracing them as assets that contribute to some more innovative thinking around quality of life. Would you look at it that way?
I think so, and I think we were Metro did an affordable housing bond that distributed low-income housing across the Tri-County region. Beaverton had the very first project out of the gate. It was our Marianne. It's in downtown Beaverton. It's close to Beaverton High School, and it was the very first that had family-sized units with more than 1 bedroom. Because we make this assumption is that if you're low income, you're living alone. And that's not the reality. Like when you look at low incomeness, housing instability in Beaverton, it is often around families. Yet we're not building that. We're sole focused on like what we see on the streets of Portland as the only thing that exists. But the reality is it's hidden. We know we have a lot of families living 10 people in a place that would totally violate our code if someone turned them in. And so we have to start being like seeing this pattern and adjusting to it. And, my mom passed about 6 months ago, but she lived with us and we became a multi-generational family. And I became the millennial that had young kids and aging parents. And my mother-in-law lived down the road. And at first it was like, oh my God, like they're in our space. But then it was like, oh, you're going to live near my children? You're going to take care of my 2-year-old so I could go for a run in the morning? And it became a very different phase of life for me. And it gave me immense joy to care for my mom in the last year of her life. That it gave me, because we had an ADU, because we had a home that was large enough to accommodate this, I think all the time about the 1-bedroom townhouse we lived in downtown Beaverton. If this had happened a decade ago, we wouldn't have been in that position. So
you've talked about the senior piece. On the other end of it, we were talking about before we started that the average age in Beaverton is 34 years old, and in Portland it's 44 years old, which is pretty significant.
Yeah.
So you have a whole set of different variables than if I go over the river and through the woods this way. And what are you proud of? What do you feel? What do you think the big wins are, and where do you feel we need more focus?
So my very first city council meeting I went to before I ran for council 12 years ago, I was sitting in the back of our building and they were talking about housing. And everyone up on the city council was north of 50 years old, making these like very broad statements about millennials. Like, millennials never want to own homes. Millennials don't want to settle down. And I was like, who are they talking about? Like, what is happening up there? And so I started paying attention and really like listening to their decision making. And those decisions they were making 12 years ago is what's coming to fruition now. And so I would just, as a segue, like who you vote for matters, because everything in government is 5 to 10 years out. And thinking about what I'm really proud of right now is the work that we're doing that's going to be impactful for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years out. What's hard for elected officials is you're often not around to see the outcome of your work. And so we've had rare incidents where I've been here, the homeless shelter started and completed. The Patricia Research Center for the Arts, I served on the council, I was on the steering committee for that. The way that it was funded was through transient lodging tax and private donation. And I just saw on this Facebook memory today, we were voting for the Patricia Research Center for the Arts, and I said, what happens if all of a sudden no one stays in hotels? And this was in 2017. And they're like, oh my God, you're a naysayer. Why would you even ask that? There's no possible way in the future that people aren't going to be in hotels. When we were like, the last $1 million of that funding we needed came during COVID, and nobody was staying in hotels, and we had to backfill it with the general fund. And I remember this woman coming from the audience and going, you're my favorite naysayer. And I was like, no, I just ask questions. And I want to find that lady and be like, what happened? But we have the, premier performing arts center. We have a homeless shelter. We have, we've invested in sidewalks more than we have in 20 years prior to that. We are at functional zero for homelessness. We have a really rad restaurant scene. I mean, we have a less than 1% commercial vacancy rate. When I was doing my State of the City this year, I kept telling the staff, I'm like, we have to find a balance between being like, oh my God, we're awesome, and the world is like crumbling, because you don't want to sound out of touch. But we're chugging along, but the work for the restaurant strategy started 10 years ago. We literally wrote a restaurant strategy when there was one restaurant on Watson and said, what would it take to like draw people in? And we did a storefront improvement program. We made Mike, our economic development guy, he went out and sat at restaurants like Ranch Pizza, and I said, don't leave until they talk to you. And we were like begging people to come and look. And we had to incentivize everybody to come to the West Side. Now we say, what are you going to do for the community if we let you open a restaurant here?
Well, so you're really kind of flipping the script on what a suburb is. I mean, I think we all have this idea in the back of our head. I mean, I do. Yeah. I mean, I live in Portland, and I often joke that I have BTSD, which is Beaverton Traumatic Stress Disorder, having to drive here. But it's
felt in reverse.
It is. Well, in fact, we have many people that come to World Oregon events who are like, I don't know, I'm not going into downtown Portland, But I do think it is really, it's impressive. And it's not that you are a utopia. I mean, I think we were talking about some of the challenges. You're really thinking about what is a neighborhood? Right. How does a neighborhood development? I mean, we think, we always hear the thing about the 20-minute neighborhood, but the neighborhoods, I think, might be a challenge. You're at 50% rental rate. And middle housing, I think, is something that everyone is grappling with. Where do you see these things headed?
So the Oregonian published a list last year of the top 6 cities that were over 50% renters. We were the only city on that list that didn't have a university in town. And that's relevant because when you're in university, usually rent and leave. And so to have that many people renting is a really big deal. And so I have focused a lot on renters' rights. When we hit COVID, I'm the one that ran the eviction moratorium, and I own rental property. And so I've done the gamut of it. But we had to protect people in their home during COVID. And so I think we've always taken this very human approach to how the city works and operates. But in my fundamental young life, like I lived in Europe. I lived in a neighborhood that we could walk to the store, we walked to the restaurant. We used to live down the street from this restaurant where you just went and they served you food. You just ate what was on the menu that day because everything was family style. We lived in the basement of a family home where the house was a vineyard, and so everyone in the house worked in the vineyard. My husband and I lived in the basement. So I've seen what other places can do. When I was in the Army, I didn't realize what we were living in was cottage clusters when we first got married. I didn't realize when I was 20 years old, I was living in basically a dorm-style apartment. As a matter of fact, the town that we lived in, Kitzingen, Germany, when it was realigned and the United States gave it back to the German government, they turned all of that military housing into low-income family housing. And people lived because, you had it was dorm-style stuff, so they were able to move a lot of people in. We don't build anything like that in the United States. We think everybody wants to live in a 4-bedroom house. And if you look at the Brookings Institute that does a lot of research on this, the average American house only has 3 people in it. And yet, since the 70s, we're building house twice the square footage of that.
Well, and so that's, to me, what's so exciting about this exhibit is there's a few things that I've sort of pulled out. The housing options for people with disabilities to me is fantastic. Co-housing, which, looking at cluster housing is a nod toward that. There's this trend of, people my age and older doing co-housing and living in situations because, maybe not with a family, but it is redefining what it means to have a family house, but also reuse. And the commercial building piece, moving beyond monofunction or even disused properties. And have you worked at all, Edward Running and I have been talking about this a lot, the Levin Land and Housing Coalition. So taking church properties and looking at how you can leverage significant amounts of real estate for housing and engagement. Is this something that you see down the road?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people know or may not know that Governor Kotek, when she was Speaker of the House, ran this as really important. Governor Kotek is a deep woman of faith, and she looked at her own church and said, what's up with all this property? Why can't we build housing here? So that was the kind of impetus of how this started to come to be. We have an inventory of mega churches in Beaverton. They have dwindling populations. A lot of these properties are owned by the Archdiocese that owns 27 million properties across the country. And so their desire to want to do this work is often limited. Why it's important from a city government, though, is when we talk about conversion of commercial property to housing, Measure 5 and 50 that was set during the 90s dictates how cities can charge property taxes. And so I came from healthcare as a healthcare executive before. We used to talk about a payer mix in healthcare. If you have some people paying nothing, you need some people paying a lot more in the American terrible healthcare system we have. Our property system is very similar. We're highly rewarded for commercial space. We are very penalized for multifamily. And so it's about 3-to-1 of a service ratio for us to serve commercial versus multifamily. And like I said before, Beaverton's 51% renter, the majority multifamily. We don't have the right payer mix. So even though we're the same size as Hillsborough, almost by population, they have 10x commercial space than us. And so that commercial space offsets the cost of housing. So when we're looking at these, sometimes it's not should we, it's can we afford to? Because if you live in an apartment, it's more important than ever that we create green space. It's more important than ever that you have access to a library. It's more important than ever that you could walk your children to the place on sidewalks with infrastructure. But how are those things funded? I've been pushing the governor to say, Beaverton does housing better than anyone else. I'm proud if you live here and work at Intel. Good for you. Drive to Hillsborough and do it. We're not going to recreate an Intel here. We can build a lot more housing if you rewarded us for doing it. We have a less than 1% commercial vacancy rate, so we wouldn't see conversion of that property here. But Portland, they're over 24%. There can be some conversion happening there, but their city's doing the same calculus. Can we afford to do this because our property tax system is so antiquated? That's probably not the answer you wanted, but that's the reality of how we're looking at it. Churches don't pay property tax now, so this is why converting church space to housing is a dynamite idea because we're not losing anything. And when we do affordable housing, we don't charge property tax. So every affordable housing project we do, not only do we not charge property tax, we waive fees, and it costs a lot of money. So if we could do this on property that's already not generating property tax revenue, that's really important.
Well, it's interesting too, because you were talking about, houseless shelters and the relationship with churches. And we were talking earlier about the notion of what it means to be a sanctuary city or a sanctuary state. And we always attach it, of course, to immigration refugee issues. But it's also about your values. So who are we as a community, and how do we welcome people, and how do we think about inclusion? At the end of the day, sanctuary is about shelter and dignity. Mm-hmm. So it's just something to keep in our brains. I want to be mindful of your time because you have another meeting. Edward, do you want to do the Montel Williams and walk around with the mic and see if we have some questions?
See if we wowed them with our intellect
Let's
and
see, Michael,
banter. Should be on a road show.
Can I walk with this one, Michael? Okay. Does it work?
So any questions?
Doesn't sound like it is.
Edward will bring you a mic and you can ask.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yes.
We've got some questions. I'm going to run through this way. Maybe Andrew, you can pass that mic over.
Hi. I was a prior resident of Beaverton for 20 years. But I moved to Minnesota briefly, and I've just come back. I was so disappointed to find out that Oregon did not have limited equity cooperatives for seniors like Minnesota does. Can either of you address why that is?
I'm unfamiliar.
Well, I couldn't address why it is, but I'm also, first of all, I'm raised in Minneapolis, and I think that we have a lot to learn from our Midwestern brethren who actually have a lot to do with places like Nordic Northwest. And I would say when we talk about importing and exporting ideas through things like the Conference of Mayors, that's a great thing to throw into the mix. I couldn't answer it.
Yeah, I'd have to do a little bit more research, but everything comes down to money, so I'm sure that's a reason, but it's like which piece. But as we're exploring what Beaverton's future looks like, what I'm challenging staff to think a lot about is our senior population, because they are the most vulnerable to all kinds of things, and housing is one of them. So I look forward to learning a little bit more about that.
There was another question over here.
Hi, thanks for this discussion. I've really enjoyed it. I work for the city of Tualatin, and I was just wondering what form of government Beaverton has. I'm not that familiar. Is it strong mayor?
So when I ran for office in 2020, it was strong mayor form of government, and they literally changed it during my election against the previous mayor. But our charter is a little bit different. I'm full-time, and I'm in charge of government relations, so I do all of the GR government-to-government interactions.
It's really impressive, the work you're doing.
Every city mayor is just like every city mayor is full-time. It's just they're not compensated. It was really important for us. The reason I couldn't be a healthcare executive and a part-time mayor. Like, we would continue to get what the cities get around us. So just whatever city you live in, you should advocate that your mayor be full-time. I raise a lot of money, over $50 million in my first term.
All right, another question from.
There's I enjoyed what I'm hearing about the programs for the homeless and equitable housing and all that, cheap housing. But I'm somewhat, as a retired ex-worker, I'm kind of irritated by this emphasis on housing and how to get housing cheaper, which infers government money, as opposed to what we hear. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes things going on I know about bringing business in, but I wish politicians would talk more about the effort to bring industry and work in, rather than spending. What we're saying is to borrow more money from the poor countries so that we can provide ourselves better housing. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. What year did you buy your house, may I ask?
The most recent house, 2021.
Yeah.
No, 2001.
Yeah. 2001?
Yeah, the first house
Yeah.
was in probably 1970.
In 1970, the average house in Beaverton was $10,000. This year, it's $600,000. In 2019, it was probably $210,000. I would say if you look at the age of Beaverton, right, my mortgage is $3,000 a month, and I live in an average size home. I also have $2,500 a month in childcare expenses because I have a young kid, compared to my neighbor who is 60 that has $700 mortgage on the same size house and no cost of living. So we have to focus on younger working families because we're pricing them out to be able to live here. I would also say I am focused as the mayor on international diplomacy and business because we're not probably going to recreate Nike, but can we drive depth in the businesses that support them? The secondary, tertiary level businesses. What are you going out of state for? What are you going out of the country for? Can we build? So if you come and work at Nike, maybe 5 years later you work in another industry close to it. Can we create these hubs of industry where you can move around more efficiently? And so we have to do that but as a mayor, I create the economic prosperity that the state gets to do through income tax. But we don't share in the prosperity because we only collect income tax, not personal tax. So I remind, every time the governor's done a kicker since I've been mayor, I've called and said, "You're welcome." We do the economic development, like, could you kick some of it back to us? And so we have this real inequity on how property tax versus income tax is spent and allocated in the state. I would make the argument that we tax enough, but the distribution has to change. If we can give $1 billion back in a kicker, yet a mayor is forced to lay off cops and librarians, this is not an equitable system when the reason they could give the money back is the work we do in economic development. So yes, and I hear you. We have to do better. I have a 8-year-old and a 2-year-old. I want them to be able to come back here. And right now, there's not a path for that unless they came back to mom and dad's house, which I would totally welcome. But I would want them to be here forever. And if we don't do the work now, 20 years from now, that's not going to be possible.
Other questions? Yeah, up here front.
Thanks very much for your comments. They're really terrific, and I think the government leaders in Portland could use some of your advice. Maybe.
They're the worst job. I have the best job.
I have a question for you, and it pertaining to the exhibits that are outside. I don't know if you've had a time to take a look at those.
This is the exhibit expert. We'll riff. Yeah.
Oh, so I was going to ask you if you could let us know what your impressions of the exhibit and some of the ideas that are mentioned there are.
I think, I really like the idea of going high. We haven't built anything over 5 stories. I think we started, and right now, to be honest, with the tariffs that the Trump administration is labeling on steel and other things, it's going to be really challenging for us to do that in the next couple of years because the cost is going to be astronomical. And anything over 5, you have to go even higher to make it affordable. But in the first Trump administration, we started cross-laminating timber as a way to circumvent tariffs, and that's what built the airport, and so innovation came out of that. And so we're looking at what level of, what are we going to do to iterate over these next couple of years as we're battling tariff, which is also going to impact wood that is grown in Canada, which we didn't have that issue last time, but it did induce steel. And so I think the one thing that we have to be really thoughtful about is big zoning, big buildings in single-family neighborhoods. Not that we shouldn't, but we should have a stair-stepped approach. Like my house, we have 3-story condos next door. It's really awesome unless there's no leaves on the tree, and then they could see directly in the backyard. So 6 months a year, it's great. The other 6 months, it's a little bit challenging. So Ann Beaverton did one of our very first kind of steps into affordable housing building was the Bridge Meadows model, which is, it pairs foster members of the foster community that take in, like if your brother, sister, aunt, uncle, and take somebody in, it pairs them with seniors in the building to work as like other grown-ups in housing. And Beaverton was the second place in the state to do that model. And it has been, and it actually was around the corner from the house my husband and I owned. And the neighbors went apeshit and been like, we don't want this in our neighborhood. And I was like, I want it in our neighborhood. Our property value went up about $30,000 when they moved in. It was a wonderful, and Dorinda Schubert that runs that program is phenomenal. So she talks a lot about intergenerational living. Beaverton is an example that it can happen here. How do we do more of it is kind of where I'm at right now.
Other questions? Yeah.
I echo all the kudos. And you may not be the person in charge of this, but I've just been so impressed with how fast the Beaverton High School has gone up. When we're sitting here talking about, high schools that badly need work, how did you manage that?
Well, I just toured it last week with the U.S. Labor Secretary, Lori Chavez-DeRemer, who is on Trump's cabinet, but was the mayor of Happy Valley. And so she wanted to tour it. So her and I went last week and met with them. I would say the city had a large role because we really cleared the path in permitting, and we really took a concierge level approach that school had to be built while the other school existed, because there was nowhere to move the kids around to, and it needed to be on an expedited timeline. This is similar to how we approached the homeless shelter. I went out on the ground and I met with a developer and I said, I drive by here every day at 2 o'clock and no one's working. People are living on the streets. You got to do better. And he's like, well, and I'm like, no, I'm going to come back next week and I want to see like a plan. Like, there's no reason you can't work from 2 to 7 p.m. That's a whole other shift at work. And I came back the next week, and, we're at mayor, like, I got to pay more, we got to do, I'm like, well, tell me a number. Like, what's it going to cost? Like, why are we not working? So the high school did something very similar. They're working in shifts, more than one. They're getting them in and going. We're not delaying permitting. My mother-in-law lives very close to the project, so it's not without some pain points. And I'll tell you, the worst constituents you can have is your mother and mother-in-law. So I do answer a lot of questions there. But the senior project developer is committed to doing it. And I think when we get developers committed to doing the work, they find a way. And that's what we're seeing there. And they're doing many different things. Also, the building material is built off-site and brought in, it's causing the construction to go a lot faster. So they are assembling large panels down the road and bringing them in and affixing them to the side of the building. So it's a different, we had some criticism. People didn't like the design of it when they saw it, but we could be building that place for 11 years and people will criticize us for something. So.
Okay, we may have
one more
before she needs to duck out and get to the council meeting. Can't wait for that, right?
I'd much rather stay here and answer hard questions about economic development. Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned raising building heights in residential areas, which I agree with you on that. But how do you talk to your constituents to get them from being a NIMBY to a YIMBY?
So, my mom, when I was campaigning for mayor, we had to kind of switch our whole tactic on how I was talking to people because I couldn't go door to door. And after this, I would go to my mom's house before she lived with us, and I was making phone calls in this side room, and I came out very frustrated. And she goes, I'm listening to you talk to people. Why do you spend so much time arguing with people? And I was like, well, I want them to vote for me. And she looks me straight in the eye and just says, you can't say the right thing to the wrong person. And my mom and her divine wisdom has kind of shaped who I am. I want to have I am known for having hard conversations. When someone lit themselves on fire at the homeless shelter, I met those community members head on. I can take the heat. I'm very unlikely going to convince you that you don't want X, Y, or Z. But what we can do is good neighbor agreements, which we've done a lot in the city. We can give people the ability to call a number of things are going wrong, and we have to be responsive to what they're saying. That doesn't mean the loudest voice gets what they want. And so we have to have a healthy mix of thank you, this is happening, it's requirement. But we've been known to change plans a little bit, kind of meet people where they are as far as like where the fencing is, where sidewalks go. But I'm not convinced quite often that you can do that. And so we don't steamroll people by any stretch of the means. People don't like change. But every development we've done, people have liked the outcome, particularly downtown. All of our bottom flooring in our affordable housing is restaurants and coffee shops and barbers, and we've done community amenities. We think that anything we build should have a community benefit add, and that's what we focus on. Like, when we built a parking garage at City Hall, we wanted the lower stuff to be, we have an arts studio down there, we have a single-use container store we can bring in and buy soaps, and we really think about those spaces as engaging and forward thinking, and so that's how we kind of approach all of these. Our senior affordable housing project, our last affordable housing project we're doing with this bonded money is going to have community action daycare on the bottom and seniors on top, 115 units of senior housing with low income, 30% AMI or below, community action daycare. And I spoke at Community Action's gala last week. I'm a proud Community Action class of 2006. And my mom, 1996. And my mom was very proud as a single mom to get me in that program. So we can do better. We can pair seniors and young people. We can pair low-income families with things they want in the bottom that other people can engage in. And every project we do can have a community add, like a park or a public space. And we have to approach every project like that.
That's great. Mayor Beaty.
Yeah, thank you
so much.
Yeah.
I hope the council meeting goes well. I want to thank you for your exceptional dedication to these issues and keeping it real for me.
Yeah. Thanks for having me today. And my friend that works in Tualatin, we're always hiring. Beaverton is a rad place to work. So. Thanks. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. If you need to catch a drink real quick, you're certainly welcome to do that. We're going to just switch gears now, and we also have another wonderful speaker here tonight that we also encourage questions. So think about it as he's talking. So we also have today Sergio Palleroni, professor, senior fellow, director of the CPID, and I can talk a little bit about that too. But Professor Palleroni is a faculty member at Portland State University in the architecture program. And in his many roles at the university as co-founder of the Homeless Research and Action Collaborative, right? And so I'm sure that'll come up in our conversations as well. There's a long list here. I think we're going to try to not listen to me stammer and stutter through the accomplishments of Sergio today because we want to hear from him. And he has a number of slides. And apparently he rolls through them pretty quickly, even though there may be more than 100. So with that, welcome Sergio Palleroni.
I'm going to stand because I will gesticulate too much.
Okay.
I told him I had to stand because I grew up in Patagonia, and my father's Italian, so we have the tradition of using our hands too much. I would fall off the stool. So hard act to follow. My God, what a mayor! I'm moving to Beaverton tomorrow. So and it's great to be here. Okay. I'm moving to. Yes, I have problems hearing too. If I start to, I have a bad habit of moving away from this. So you let me know. Okay. That's scary close. Okay. So it's great to be here. I actually got my first professional license in Europe, and so I got my European license. And my first place I worked was I was thrown out. I was working for a Spanish architect, Rafael Moneo. He's a well-known architect from Spain, and he got the contract to design the National Museum of Art in Stockholm. And so he said, Sergio, we need a project architect, so why don't you move there? And I moved there in September, and I left in May, and I think I never saw daylight ever, because I skate to work, it'd be dark. Then we went to a building that had no windows really, and then I would leave at 5 in the afternoon, and it was dark again, and it was just, I miss seeing beautiful Scandinavia. And then I've worked a lot in the Netherlands, and I've been on the housing commissions of Eindhoven and Utrecht and now Rotterdam. So we do a lot of housing. The Dutch are famous for housing. And they have a totally different approach to housing than we do in America. And in America, we have this very conflictive relationship with housing. You know, we went through a President Reagan, who one moment overnight got rid of public housing. You know, there was kind of a building feeling in the country that public housing hadn't served. There's a lot of buildings from the 50s that were being destroyed because they were not proper housing. They were really terrible housing, but used the opportunity to shut down housing. So we're the only developed country in the world, actually we're the only country in the top 50 economies in the world that has no public housing. So as a result, you know, we have to figure out ingenious ways to get at housing. So that's what's so impressive about your mayor. It's one of the amazing things about getting housing done when there's really no housing, national housing program. So my God, I'm going to get, so my role is, so we have a firm, we do housing, but what I'm best known for is trying to figure out how we're going to train the next generation of architects or civic makers, you know, through the education system that will tackle housing, that will tackle public architecture. So I'm somehow listed as a public interest design pioneer. I don't know how, but I saw that in Wikipedia. Somebody in Wikipedia said that. And I'm kind of what I've been doing I was a professor at University of Washington for 15 years, and I was at University of Texas, and then the Miller Foundation gave money to PSU, and they invited me here to be part of the PSU to start this National Center for Public Interest Design. And what we've been trying to do for the last, since I was 24, 38, 39 years, is to try to figure out how we train young emerging citizens in a kind of focus on the public well-being. And how what does that involve? What would a public interest designer be? You know, one that focuses on not just, the 4 or 5% that we serve of the population and as architects in this country, but what would happen if we, like the Netherlands, 82% of the population was served by architecture, and how could we make that work within the constraints of the economy we have? So I've been attempting in a very utopian way, but actually a thing is to begin to train what I call civic environmentalist. Civic, because civic means about rights and responsibilities. So it teaches young people about the kinds of base values and challenges of being a citizen, and which is democracy as a working principle in your life and in your profession. And environmentalist because it's both about the environment, but it's also the human environment. So I collapse both into it. So, I knew I had something here. So, poor Tim, we have done so many projects. I think we're up to 286 projects we've done in the last 30 years. We've been very busy. That at one moment today, there was 396 slides, so I thought, unless they're offering breakfast next day, we're never going to make it through this progress. So where do I point it to? Maybe. There it goes. So I direct this Center for Public Interest Design. It's a national institution. I also one of the founders of the Homelessness Research Center. The Homelessness Research Center is there. It's one of 5 institutions in the country that's looking at, policy and data and trying to figure out how we move forward. So we inform, with the reports and everything we generate, just inform people, governments, Beaverton, all of us. We have clients all over the West, and we meet with the other centers. We try to start to figure out, okay, what is the nature of homelessness, rather than having an opinion that comes from anxiety or whatever, or feel overwhelmed by the situation. If we start looking at the specifics of it, we start talking to the people who are actually homeless, what's happening. So I'm part of that, but really the center is about, we're trying to investigate what would be a public interest designer. When I was trained, there was no such thing. And so we had to make the rules. In the last 3-4 decades, we've just been making up the rules. What is public interest designer? It's more than just an architect. It's more than just a planner. We have students in architecture, planning, et cetera, coming through. And it has a series of skills. Like when I went through architecture school, I was never taught how to talk to a client. I had, I was like a doctor without any personal training, thrown in, and, just when we had it. So usually you would get the recipe, which is like, the room sizes, et cetera, and then we would just like start designing, right, from the ingredients of the recipe. And then we would have some meetings with the client, maybe the higher ups, but we were never really taught to get at the base of the issues and questions. And we were taught in a very kind of prescriptive, more narrow way, which was wonderful. I love my education in architecture, and I had a wonderful education in architecture. But I kind of I was missing a lot of things because architecture had this ability, and I began to feel more and more, having come from South America, is that architecture had this power to be transformative, and it wasn't realizing that power. So I felt like I had to be part of that. So at the center, we do design. We had the first national program in public interest design and certificate. We have a degree in that. It was the first one in the Americas. And we have since established 18 of them at Harvard, everywhere in the West. We consider the top program in the country in that. And we do research. We go look at what people are doing, public designers, emerging public designers all over the world. We see how the heck are you engaging a community, or how are you dealing with economics of development, et cetera. And then we bring them in, we study those models, and then we teach the students those models. And then we figure, okay, let's apply it in a project here and see if it works and how it works. So I poked this poor student out, but in a typical education, you might be, this student worked in a project to convert a village in Inner Mongolia to elderly housing. We had a project from the Rockefeller Foundation, and worked in American Indian housing, which is one of our big initiatives. It's now a HUD program. We'll see if it survives. And he worked in a series of projects throughout his experience. So his training was both in real projects and the architecture training you need, which is very rigorous and very controlled. But at the heart of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to collapse the students and the community. I'm trying to create this kind of symbiotic relationship between them, a kind of relationship where I don't just keep the students in the classroom, but I send them out to work in projects throughout the world. And they have to, with the community, co-design. It's not just the designer, but the community that's designing with them. And so, it's based with the idea of praxis, which is the Greek word at the base of practice, which actually comes from the word reflection. How do we reflect on the world that we live in? And so if you're doing practice, you should really be reflecting on what your actions are, et cetera, which is something that it was 6 years into my training and practice, I realized, oh God, I should reflect on this, because you just never have time. You're just keeping ahead. So, and then I throw them into the real world, as I mentioned, and we've worked in a range of places. This is in one of the largest and fastest growing squatter communities in Mexico, in the world, actually. And we consider every site that we go to as a site of learning, both for the community and us. We start this process, we co-design with the community, come up with, in this case, in the middle one, it's a school in the middle of a massive squatter community east of Mexico City, and to the left is this American Indian housing project that's straw bale construction in the mountain states. But in each place, we consider that a place of knowledge and exchange. Like we start to build this building, and people come in, and we don't put a fence around it. We have open days where the community participates, and we ask them, well, what do you think? Is it working? Is it not working? So we start a conversation long before the project starts, generates the design, and then even as it gets built, the conversation continues about what the building should become or should do. So that by the time the building is finished, the community feels like it's part of the fabric of the community. So, and that leads us to rethink, like here we are with a group of native, the guy in the white shirt is the head of 12 native communities in central Mexico, and the students are having to not show him a drawing, because who understands a drawing? It takes the average architecture student 4 years to figure out what the heck an architectural drawing does and do one well. So how can you ask somebody who's not an architect to understand an architecture drawing. So we find ourselves doing models. Here's a model for a disability, a clinic for disabled indigenous children. Disability in the developing world is very high. And he understands it much better. He's seeing it almost like in real scale. We actually ended up building a full-scale version of this before we built it. It's about half the size of this building. We built it with ring and things, and people walked through it and said, oh yeah, this is beautiful, but we don't use corridors. Why do we have a corridor? Anyway, so the conversations get richer, and this is me at a younger age, of course. I'm having a conversation across the neighbor's house on structure and calculating this beam that has failed. And we also, it's an opportunity in each immersion to figure out what are the things that the community really prides itself. It may be poor, but it may have very rich traditions, like this community here in brick making. Beautiful handmade bricks in Michoacan that led us to create this chapel, actually a place of learning in the community. All by hand, all cantilevered, everything brick, ended up costing, I think, $380 for a 3,500 square foot building, because all handmade brick. Anyway, and then we have a database and we share it globally. But I think the thing is, in a way, it's kind of designed for survival, but it puts us right in the community. So I'm going to take you through a few housing projects very quickly. I'm sorry I'm moving so quickly. But anyway, I love each of these projects. We've done about 92 different housing projects, but I'm going to just show you 3 or 4 of them. This is one of my favorites. It's actually working with single mother Yaqui mothers in the Sonoran Desert. And the Sonoran Desert, which you know goes from Arizona down into Baja, it's like the Amazon of deserts. It's a bad analogy. Anyway, it's the ecologically richest desert environment on Earth, like 5 times as rich. If you ever see the bird count they do every year, and every birders go out and they count the number of birds that they're in a community in 24 hours and see who counts the most bird species, this desert perennially wins. Every other year it wins the championship for more bird species. So, but it's interesting, this is a community that's in the middle of a desert that has become industrialized. Industrialized because this is where the Green Revolution existed. A Mexican agricultural engineer and an American won the Nobel Peace Prize, actually, for coming up with the Green Revolution, which is these hybrids that you feed enough pesticides and enough vitamin and all sorts of nutrients, and they produce massive corn and massive tomatoes and everything like that. And it changed the logic. It brought India out of pure starvation into things. It transformed the world. But it also had this tremendous impact on the women of the region. And it had the impact because if you put enough of these chemicals, they go solvent in the water, and the women, the Yaqui women, who have traditionally lived in this area, suffer from the highest cancer rate among females in the world. As a product, it's just filtering through the whole system. So our housing is really, when we first started, they are the single poorest community in Mexico. Half the population of households is headed by women, where the men has migrated to work in the United States and has never come back because poverty is so extreme. It has destroyed families. So the question about it is, how did we create a housing program for these communities? And it started out as an act of solidarity of women, wealthy community, women in that region who reached out to the poor women who sometimes were their servants, etc., and deciding they had to do a women-to-women solidarity act. And so we actually, we realized that the Mexican government has a housing bond. They do about 1 million houses a year, one of the most active public housing sectors in the world. But it was just falling behind, and these people were not being addressed. So we knew that it had to be a private-public initiative because there wasn't enough money in the federal government, and also because the women earned so little that they didn't even qualify most times for the federal programs. So we created a thing which brought a series of people together. So this was design. This is where my students are starting to design. I'm at the University of Texas at that moment, and we have to come up with a way to figure out how to put the little money they have, the ability that they know the land and the materials, etc., and put all those things. Some is social capital, some is economic capital, some is gifting that comes from the private sector, some is coming from public housing money, and how we could put all those little pots together to make a housing program. And then we go out, and the women said, you know, we love the way we used to live in the Nederland before they all industrialized the desert. You know, the desert is like a third of it is industrialized, but it feeds us 60% of our winter produce comes from here for the United States. And here they used to live in the desert. They would move from households and households made from the earth itself, very simple but beautiful existence. And they feel like concrete blocks. You know, it's a great way to build very fast, but to them it's a sign of the industrialization of their world that has brought the disease. The concrete block doesn't bring cancer, but it's an expression of that. So they wanted to move to an earthing kind of construction. So we came up with a catalog of different designs, sitting down with the women. They got an architect. They sat down. We came up with 38 designs. And then we figured out with MIT and Tecnológico de Monterrey how to change the chemistry of Adobe so they could build an Adobe, because men build Adobe by stomping it on with their feet and their bodies. And women are multitasking. They have kids, especially if they're a single-family household. And so a woman needs to make the Adobe by hand, you know, like if she's kneading bread. So how do you change the chemistry and everything so it meets structural code and can be done while you're multitasking and cooking and taking care of kids and everything like that? So because they needed to build their block to make the economic equation work. So here's actually my students. We had composting toilets. Our thing is that we were going to make them totally bring every tradition they had, that they lived in the land in a closed economy where their waste, everything was one cycle. Could we bring that in a housing program? So we borrowed industrial leftover material, and in typical way, we come up with a housing model, and then we built 5 of the houses with the community to get the thing started, and builders and the women, et cetera, to make sure that the system worked. And that's me inaugurating a house, et cetera. There was a program, if you would like to see it, it's called Design E Squared. It was BBC and PBS did a thing on ecological design worldwide, and they had one on New York getting green and China getting green. In between, and it was little us that said, green for all. You know, it was like, they showed up in Mexico, and I was like, you know, what is this PVC showing up? But it's a really beautiful program. This is from the program of me inaugurating a house. You see the gates are being made from found material, etc. But this house is actually really lovely. And what's interesting about it, we work with the Grameen Bank. I don't know, you know the Grameen Bank. It's the idea that the microcredit lending, the thing that if you lend somebody a small amount strategically, it'll transform their life. So with the Grameen Bank, we came up with a strategy where women were organized in groups of 25 as a savings society. And they all helped each other save for a housing bond. It took 2 years to save money. They raised money by making jams and making materials, etc. And at 2 years, they had saved, made all their payments, all 25 had made their payments, etc. Then they got all housing bonds, and they could start the building. And by end of year 3, they had a home. And then by end of year 6, they owned their home outright. So the interesting thing about it is that we just, these women became super savers. They're just amazing. And the thing about having what the Grameen Bank's brilliant idea was, is if you have 25 people and the kid is sick one day, or if somebody has an accident or something like that, and 2 of the members cannot pay, the other 23 will pitch in and complete the payments. So this whole thing became highly successful. Our default rate, I don't know, it's like, I think a professor at University of Texas, a colleague of mine, calculated that it was 1/5 of the default rate on loans in Austin, Texas, where I was based. So it was like, and then I took the money, despite all this thing, after 300 homes, we actually had a net amount, about $1.6 million. They had accumulated excess money. And I went to the Inter-American Bank and I said, listen, this is something transformative. And I had to match it. So now we have a fund. In year 2028, it's going to complete housing all 19,000 initial families. So that's like, okay, so nothing here. I haven't told you about the architecture very much. I haven't told you anything about it, but I've told you how people rethinking the way the economics and relationships and how they organize themselves have all come to create a housing program. Out of what, if you told a developer how you're going to get those houses, they say, well, there's just not enough money. But we refigured the system to achieve kind of this dignity. So we have actually used similar methodologies in Portland. At the center, we started out, there was a successful village that was created by the homeless community themselves and has now been moved near to the airport on permanent land. But the Coalition of the Homeless, there is a Coalition of the Homeless, and they reached out to us, to the center, because we had worked on the teenage homelessness initiative for the city. And they said, we'd like some help. Right now we're being marginalized. We think that the city's programs are really kind of scattered and, it makes sense from our experience. And people are not treating us like we have any expertise. They're talking about us, but not including us in the conversation. So this is actually a meeting. I don't know if you all know, in Mississippi, I don't know if you've wandered into Portland, but there's a street named Mississippi, very hip street, was the heart of a lot of change in the fabric, a lot of experiments in urban fabric development happened in this area. And there's this rebuilding center, which has an international reputation. It's this place that was created by the community to capture waste as a way to create resources and jobs for the community. It supports about 200 people who otherwise would be unemployed in the area with minimum wage, all these things. And in it, they have been offering space every 2 weeks. A Congress of Homeless, which representatives of the bigger housing communities, homeless communities in Portland, all meet and make decisions and talk about, well, where's food, where's shelter, what are the big issues, and they meet. And this movement grew out of the deep democracy movement that happened with Occupy Wall Street. So Wall Street collapsed in 2008. Everybody said, well, the economic system does not work. People said, we need to rethink, money and ownership and democracy. So it came from people with money, but it affected and filtered down and affected people who were in the street. So the deep democratic began. So we're meeting. We got invited here. My colleagues there on the side shadow. And we met with them. And out of it came a kind of deeper understanding of what was working. And it was also informed by the point in time, which is this survey that happens all the time about who's homeless, just happened, told us the situation hasn't gotten a lot better. And we began to talk to this community, and they said, what we'd like to do is we have found that the one thing that allows people to survive on the street is that we have what we call street families. We all get together, and we protect each other, and as a family, some people are gathering food, and some people are figuring out where we're going to live, and this is all these things. And that street family is what is, yes, 40% of the people on the street have fallen through cracks and are a mental illness and incapable of doing anything. But like 60, 70% are just trying to organize themselves around survival. So we would like you to take on the idea of this village being a possible model for development and see if we can promote it. And so we went deep into it, and we just decided, okay, we're going to look at these villages as deep democracy in action. People organize themselves. Deep democracy meaning people are actually, everybody has a single vote. They vote on everything. In this village, which is one of the one we went to study, studied three deeply for a year. This village, the guy who's standing up there in a striped shirt is the mayor. Literally, an announced mayor. There's one guy who's head of the food crews, then has set up the kitchen. There's some people who are doing actually community gardens. There's a third of the group are working in community gardens and raising food. There are people who are building homes, etc. And we looked at how they distributed, how they made decisions, all these things. And we said, there is something here that potentially could become a model for, moving forward. So, and they had this sign which inspired us, tiny homes, not tents. So we decided, I said, okay, how are we going to really explore this issue? So we did a report It was great, with the technical, scientific, academic report that he's doing. But really what we learned a lot from this community and how it's operating, how relationships were established. We learned a lot about a client. And then we said, what we need is we came up with a plan of action. And we do this thing. We create like a comic strip of what our plan of action is. I mean, okay, there's a 100-page, boring as heck document that is the back of this, explaining why each action is being taken. But this is our poster. You put it up there, we talk about the actions we're going to take, etc., and it explains the whole procedure. And really, what the procedure was, I decided, okay, the one problem that happens with this is that we have this problematic relationship with the homeless in the streets, which I have a lot of times myself. So we need to bring the community closer to understanding it. So what I did is I invited the 15 most prominent firms in the Portland area, and I sat them down. I mean, there were more I invited, not all of them showed up, but even ZGF, all the big ones, Bora, all the showed up, all the good ones, sexy, non-sexy, pedestrian, every kind of firm, housing firms, everything showed up. And I borrowed Mercy Corps' world headquarters, which happens to be in near the Burnside Bridge, beautiful building. And I said, let's have a moment. Okay, so sorry, I'll get ahead. Here we're studying the homeless. Here's the kitchen, et cetera, et cetera. So what we did is we said, let's just get them together. Let's treat them as clients. So for an entire weekend, 300 representatives of the different communities sat down with architects, with 260 architects from different firms throughout the city, and were treated like normal clients. And they sat down and had a conversation you would have with the client, talking about, well, what do you need in a home, etc. And out of it came this is the guy on the right is the head of the Homeless Coalition, and the guy on the left also as well now. And we came up with all these designs, and at the end of the weekend, we invited Mayor Wheeler. We ambushed Mayor Wheeler. We invited him because we asked ZGF and the big firms to invite him, and of course he wasn't going to say no to the big firms. So he showed up, and we showed him all these designs that had come up. They were all over, and he said, we have come up with these tiny homes, which the things, and the idea of a village based on the experiences of people. And we think there's an idea here that could get you out of the crisis. He was having a political crisis. How he could be homeless. Everybody, he was afraid to show up at town city hall because, he was ambushed by everybody asking what's going to happen with homeless. So I said, this may be a great act to do. This is October. So we had him up in front. We said, we just need $500,000 to build the first 30 tiny homes. And that's also for the land development, et cetera. And what could he do? He couldn't say no. He had all these kind of powerful figures there. So we got him to go. He said yes. And this financial part, we decided, okay, we sent the firms back to their offices, and they did construction documents on each of the proposals they had come up with. And then we did an exhibit. And the exhibit became first in City Hall. You see, each board is a different firm. So this is one firm. Right here, this is SRG, this is a different firm, this is McKinsey, different firms throughout it, and each had a poster and showed their designs. They were brought to City Hall. We had the mayor, we presented it, got the city council there. Everybody is okay, so we have these designs, and now the mayor has agreed to pay for their building, for the first, for everybody's model building to be built. And we brought the city council and said, what if this was a village? Let's give the people, Christmas is coming, let's get this built as a sign that there is a future. It's Christmas, it's a time to think changes in the air. So we actually had this exhibit, these are different directors, and we decided, okay, we're going to build it. So we got the oldest warehouse on the river, since burnt down. We didn't burn it down. It burned down on its own. And 1873, it's crazy. Anyway, and in it, over in end of November to the first week of December, we built all the different model homes. And here the different crews finishing it. And then we brought it out to the park blocks and said, let's, people have streets of dreams, right? From where you see the beautiful houses that you might be building. They used to do these street of dreams everybody would walk through for the middle-class housing or upper. He said, well, we're going to have a street of dreams on these little houses that have been designed, these little houses. And the dimension of the little houses is based on the fact that there's a loophole in the code for anything that fits into a parking space. If you can move it and it fits on a parking space, you can build it through, with a limited code thing. So that's how we got into that. And you can see they're totally different. This is actually Hacker, the little triangle thing. It's better for a camping site. It's just so beautiful. SRGs is over there, etc. This is Scott Edwards, Architects, etc. You can go through all of them. Anyway, and inside they're just lovely little homes, with the basic accommodations that they don't have bathrooms, because if we put a bathroom, we make a code violation. And they have a seating area, they have a place to put their food, they can sleep, they can claim the space. And sometimes people got really ingenious. This one, the table and everything, you could put up your bed, you could there, you could even have people over to eat with you. And here's the mayor of that town that we showed you earlier, now in the little house. He was very proud. He got this thing. But anyway, and here we also invited the UN to have their shelter. So this is a UN shelter, which actually costs 3 times the cost of ours. So it shows you we were onto something. And then the mayor said, I said, well, where are we going to put it? He said, we have 178 properties that are warehouses. Every city has properties there. They have warehousing for future development. I said, you can have any of them as long as you don't put a permanent, which they were not by code. They couldn't be permanent. So we said, yes, that's fine, but we really want this village to establish a mode of operation for the city. We don't want to just dump it because people are going to resent it. We want to create a way that every village that goes in has a relationship with the communities coming in and develops a close relationship. So we brought together the Congress of the Homeless said the first people that should be sheltered are women, because women are the most impacted in street life. It's a terrible condition. So what we're going to do is we showed all the parties. There's a diagram of all the parties involved. We brought all the stakeholders and people who would get involved. And you see signs up there, upper right. We went for 3 months with the community of Kenton and actually had deep conversations about them. Well, if a village is here, what do you do? What do you need from it, etc. And the conversations were very fruitful. And I'm going to move away from this. And this photograph you see down here is like one of those 1930s neorealist films, 1940s, where it's in black and white, and people are voting for civil rights. And we had 600 people, 200 over a fire code in the Kenton Community Center. And the poor mayor, really, you can see him in back, and people are screaming, well, you got to put this house and everything. But in the end, the community voted 280 to 93 households in support of it. So that was great. And we said, listen, a year from now, we'll take the vote again. If you didn't like it, we'll move the village. You are our pioneers, your gods. You have taken the first step that a lot of communities in the city are. Laurelhurst didn't want to, everybody's like, oh, not in our backyard. Interestingly enough, 18 months later, we had the vote. It was 393 to 2. Only 2 households voted against it. So the experience of co-living in a community that they had co-created, both communities together, was transformative. So this you see the site they gave us near Kenton. You see the community working with us, trying to decide. We did these little make-believe and things, and then we went out there. We built. There were things that both the existing community and the community that was going to be hosted needed, like community gardens, a place to have a Saturday market, things that they could share and become more unified. And that's what connected them together. So here we see them building it in, put it in place, and volunteers coming together, Super Team 2017. And then we built with a fabricator in Oregon City. We began to fabricate. There's a shower units in blue, kitchen units in yellow, so that you're not going to have your kitchen inside the unit because then you screw up fire code. And the one thing as an architect, never touch fire code. It's one way for your building to fail. You know, you can never pass, you never get a permit. So we built this really beautiful building. I'm sitting in the, you know, it's twice as big as this, really nice building. And we kind of created it. And this is the cycle of it coming together. Now, what we did is, it worked really well. It went out. We had this exit of the thing. Then the city said, okay, it's, you know, we're a pickle. Just, okay, what do we do next? And so, I'm sorry the mayor's not here. Well, she knows this really. So we decided to hit Clackamas. Clackamas had a large veterans population. So we said the next population, and the Congress of the Homeless said, yes, that's the agreement. Veterans coming back, a high number of them end up homeless. A lot of mental issues, homeless. You know, if you house a person, then you can deal with their mental issues. If they're still in the street, you've lost the battle. So based on that housing first model, went ahead. And we actually, in our center, we every year produce the stages for Pickathon, which is a big music festival that happens in this region. And what we have done with them is we have a circular economy model. So whatever we make the stages, which are quite beautiful, have won the state AIA award several times, we recycle the material because we believe that you don't make a stage, you don't throw it away. So what happened is that these stage that year was actually made, you see those are actually trusses. We made the entire stage, 200 feet, 6 stages and everything out of these trusses. And these trusses were actually the elements of one of SRG's design, Scott Mooney, a great young architect. And when assembled, like Lego pieces, became the 40-some houses for the homeless community. So we got essentially the Pickathon festival paid for the Veterans Village. So here you see them laid out, people beginning to claim them, etc. And really, the village thing has grown. We're now up to 11 villages. We have 900, we'll have by the end of the year 912 tiny houses as first line of defense. We're now working on communities of all ages, which are these larger communities that sit on 5 to 10 acres, which are based on the integrative, having people from young couples all the way up to elders, all in the kind of 30 to 60% to 80% MFI. Because what's missing, and the mayor alluded to it, is the fact that, okay, you house them, you stabilize them, but then the next step is missing in our market. What's happened in the housing market in general over the last 40 years, since the 60s, 70s, is that as the market has speculation has begun to happen in housing, we began to lose that starter home. We've begun to lose the next home. You start with a tiny home and you might move to a bigger home. So our housing spectrum looks like a bunch of missing teeth, where if you start one place, you don't have the next home. Or if you are renting and you want to own your first tiny home, there's just nothing in that market being offered. So that's what we've been working. And we've also been working because the villages, all of a sudden FEMA has become a supporter. And last few villages we've done in Forest Grove, et cetera, we have FEMA as a major player because FEMA has realized that we have those kitchens, we have those bathrooms, we have water systems, everything. They are our first line of defense. If the big one hits, our network of the 11 villages there, and now the ones we're beginning to build in Hillsborough and Forest Grove and McMinnville are actually could become the place that will absorb and become the anchors for the first few months of survival. So here we start with that. The nice thing about this story, I'll conclude it, is that the next step, Kenton Women's Village had to move eventually because the land was slated for development. Holt's design came up with housing, beautiful housing, for the next step for people. These are people in the 30% median family income. And this is the housing community that replaced it now. Really gorgeous, made of modular housing, very beautiful design. And the nice story, well, what happened to the Kenton Women's Village? The community got together and raised money to buy a plot of land so they could move the women and keep the women in their community. So that's how the system has grown. And and I was talking about the missing middle, that missing middle of housing that we have now, where we're trying to develop, well, okay, we captured them street, we've got them there. Where's the housing projects that go to the next step? And we've now, in the last 7 years, worked on 14 community for all ages models based on what we call an asset-based community development process that we weave into every community, look at the community, say what's missing in this community. And this, for example, this is Rockwood, which is a community that's between Gresham and Portland. It's a place of greatest economic diversity and greatest poverty in the metro area. And they basically had no town center. They didn't have a clinic. They didn't have anything. So in coming up with this housing project with community development partners, a development agency, developer, we programmed, we went and talked to the whole community, talked about the asset they needed, and you see at the heart of it is this park. And community said, this is what the site looked like, and the design, and this is what it ended up in the community. And this beautiful community center, beautiful housing, last year won the National Housing Prize from the U.S. Congress of Housing. And and so we now have 14 of these. This is the next step. The thing we're struggling now is how as these families move and decide to move to home ownership, which is the way in America you build equity to survive and to retire and to go on. There's the thing. How do we develop that home? I don't know. Maybe it'll come out of the next generation of architects we're trained. So anyway, thank you.
So what is so remarkable about this actually shouldn't be remarkable, which is the Danish Housing Lab starts with a basic premise, which is looking at variables and asking questions. And so often, if you look at mass housing after, say, World War II, it was created for this idea of asset-based community development, which you would assume is some crazy radical notion, is built on asking better questions.
Yeah.
And so Sergio, a lot of your background really, you were inspired early on by doing UN humanitarian and disaster response work, weren't you?
Yeah. I worked, my first 10 years were in war zones. I worked in the Sahara when Spain was fighting the Berbers. I worked in Nicaragua during the non-war and the station. So I started out in emergency relief and reconstruction, what happened. And then I ended up in Mexico City after the earthquake, which was an amazing reconstruction. And I think that's kind of tipped it, because Mexico City, okay, we think Mexico disaster, but it's actually the social fabric was so strong that hours after the earthquake hit, and it was one of the most massive earthquakes to ever hit a major city. Wow. Anyway, people were organizing themselves to make sure that everybody was okay, everybody was accounted for. People were organizing food and things like that without any government instruction. It was amazing. And what I learned was the importance of the social fabric and involving people as the hidden asset in the work, which is what I've been tapping to. My magic potion in all the solutions is people have capacities, people have insights that we often don't bring in because we don't talk to them. And those, maybe that's just enough to tip the scale and make the solution possible. So I've been having deep conversations with people ever since,
Well, so the whole idea of this was really to have a conversation between the here and the there, which is, in the Danish Housing Lab, we've got this whole notion of self-build, and so much of the work you're talking about is about participatory design. Now, Edward, you're an architect. You don't just play one on television. You actually had to go through the process.
Yes, right.
So how much were you prepared for the idea of giving over power and listening?
Right.
and really working in a community as an architect.
Well, it's interesting because you bring up this point that the mayor brought forward when she was talking, this idea that she was in the back of the room listening to people that didn't have that experience. They didn't have a perspective which then could lend to some of the solutions that also you were working with in that room full of people that got to a consensus, or at least got to quite a large majority saying it was okay versus the NIMBY, which we're all a little worried about, right? Not in my backyard.
Yeah.
I think that in some ways we think it's more complicated, and it is, but yet the results outweigh the challenge of allowing people to be empowered, allow people to be heard, and understand the complexities that then build in so much more powerful and better solutions. It's a little more complicated, but the results are so much more.
Yeah.
And you showed us that, right?
And I think that, I don't know, I'm trying to think, any young people left? I don't know, some back there. But anyway, I don't know, if you try to pencil out, we have 4 kids. I don't know how they're going to pay for their future, I mean, like 50%, we have one daughter living in New York City, 55% of her income goes to her rent. It's like, I'm going, well, how are you paying for your food, honey? And it's like, you worry as a parent. And so I didn't grow up in that kind of economy, even in the United States, and I think that cannot happen. And so the thing about the Danish thing is 28% of their income goes to housing and housing development. That leaves, my God, it leaves 3/4 of your income to do other things you need to do to have a life, And I think that the shift, the fact that we have allowed the, speculation on land and all these things to just take power away from us and we don't know how to act on it, has just basically shifted the whole equation in a way that very few of us can afford to own a home or have a future. And all of us who are like right here, we kind of made it through that things, but all the next generation, I don't know how they're going to make it. I mean, literally, we need to begin to fundamentally rethink the way we're doing things. So otherwise, there's going to be very few housing choices in the future. So.
We talk a lot about, especially this region, you hear about green building and sustainability. And I think what I love so much is that for years, that was, photovoltaic, windows and bioswales. But by bringing students to Mexico or the Middle East, you're looking at the other pillars of sustainability, which is the social and the economic. I always think of my mom. My mom was a Depression-era kid who would say, I love that you guys always talk about sustainability. She said, we called it common sense when I was growing up. But, this village model, this didn't pop out of nowhere. This came from your field work, right?
Yeah. And actually, I'm thinking like, Edward, I was thinking the one thing about being an architect, I have to, a truth in lending thing. I started as a pure mathematician. That's what I studied, pure math. So I was like, I come from a family of scientists, I was doing pure math, and I ended up in Barcelona. And it was Barcelona, they had been under 45 years of fascism, they fell apart, and then architects started coming out and becoming the leaders of making what we know now of Barcelona, one of the cities everybody goes to marvel at. And they were just having discussions about everything, economics and housing and what people's rights were and civil rights. And there was this brilliant guy, Oriol Bohigas, the greatest planner of the later 20th century in Europe. And he said, design gives you more tools than any profession. He said it gives you tools to think about economics, it talks about aesthetics, it talks about social values, all these things, and you can put them all in the soup and make this minestrone soup, and nobody says, oh, that's outside your realm. Like, if you're an economist, they say, oh, no, you can't be talking about that, or things like that. But in design, it's like this powerful tool that, as an architect, every day you're mixing all these things together, and it's just this powerful tool. And so I just start with the students and say, you're going to learn the most powerful way of thinking that I know, and I'm going to teach you new ways of cooking with it, so you come up with solutions that you might not have otherwise thought about, like, a homeless program from, like the mayor, from nothing, So we basically have built 912 tiny houses in the city for $1.8 million. So it's, and on 12 lots of land, some with the Catholic Church. We're now working on the 82nd quarter. It's 5 Catholic churches, and on the hinterlands, the 82nd marks the inner and outer city, saying, my church would rather have the parking lot be housing than, us parking the car there, so.
Well, and thinking about liminal space, after World War II in Holland,
Yeah.
Van Eyck built
Oh, yeah.
playgrounds in these little weird pockets and places that you wouldn't build a house, but you could access. And
Yeah.
they might be, you might have to figure out how to navigate them with some ambiguity, but that's how we learn our wayfinding and our place in the city.
Yeah. No, if you haven't seen his work, it's beautiful. I one time did a workshop with him in some fancy workshop, and somehow we both got invited. And I was starting my career, and we were all living, we were on sumptuous estate, and we were all like, oh my God, my bedroom, look at the quality of the sheets, and by night I was thinking, where is he? And it turned out he had squirreled himself away and was living with the housekeepers on the corner. Because he wanted to experience every type of space, that was available. It was pretty amazing.
Well, so I have a question for both of you. In looking at the work you've done globally, because part of this was about, we wanted the mayor, because the mayor can talk about what's happening here. What's the conversation that's happening in our own backyard with the ideas we're seeing in the exhibit? Sergio, we wanted you to be here to talk about when you have gone out there, into that big wide world and come back, what are the things you're bringing back in? And for both of you, what do you think we can learn in the Tri-County area from these projects? And is there a path forward, and do you continue to be inspired by the possibility, or do you get trampled by the regulation and the why instead of the why not?
I don't know. You want to start?
Well, I could start in one way. I liked the idea that the mayor brought forward, where we were under tariffs, and so rethinking building materials. Yeah. And it really helped to reinvigorate what was already happening in terms of local materials and the technology of wood, and expanding it beyond its capacities to sort of create a new building material that wasn't necessarily so new, it just forced the issue, right? It forced innovative thinking. And I think that's the period we're at right now, and a lot of the work that you've been showing is it's forcing innovation. The mayor talked about it in terms of policy and innovation, and using community methods to get to better solutions that actually are at the heart of better solutions, right? Because it's involving those local voices. Yeah. So local materials, local voices. I think when you get to these pressure points, energy is focused, and then some results come from it.
Yeah, I think we just, I've worked in so many places with so little, and I look at the Northwest and I go, oh my God, it's so beautiful. I love this place. I grew up in Patagonia. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth. But I just love the Northwest. I just think, God, we have everything. And I come back to Portland and I go, my God, how can we be down on ourselves? We have so much here that we could be working with. It's ridiculous. We're down. Sometimes it's just attitude. It's the shifting thing. It's not maybe the economics, but just thinking it's possible, not thinking it's impossible. And so I think that it's kind of so sometimes I come back and I think, it's just the attitude. And sometimes it's having the attitude of a good mayor, kind of saying it's possible to do this. And also, I think it's, we have resources, we have an extraordinarily temperate, the most temperate climate in the country, we have all these things going for us, the diverse ecosystem, I don't know if you've heard, I'm on the UN Climate Commission, and we meet, and Seattle and Portland are two of the 15 cities in the world, they have had less shift in their climate in the world. We're just in a bubble ecologically. We're just like protected in this bubble. So there's so much going. My God, we should be dancing naked in the streets and celebrating. I'm just saying, it's like so extraordinary the place we are. We should just be making it the best place, because it's like it's quite spectacular, And I just feel like, why are we down on ourselves? We are people of conscience. We are deeply embedded in the institutions of democracy. I don't know if you saw that. It was in the New York Times. My favorite piece of news in the last 2 weeks. I can't even open the newspaper, but there's these 2 young kids from Salem High School. They won the National Constitution Championship, and I was like, nobody under 15, teams of 15 even got to the final ever in the history of this competition. They won it. They swept it. They got the only perfect score, and I was thinking, and then who tied them in the end? Lincoln. I was thinking, the kids, they know the Constitution. I mean, my God, it made me happy. Anyway.
And so, but this brings up, I'm going to just ask one more question, then we'll get to your
take some
question.
questions to the audience.
But, so you're educators, and this, and we've been talking about intergenerational conversations. And I often hear people say, the kids, they're all tuned out in their devices and they're not blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I say, have you actually sat and talked with a 15 to 17-year-old or a 21-year-old or 22-year-old? Democracy is often described as the art of the possible. And I look at this generation of young minds who are so positively intersectional in their thinking, so they're not learning. When they're thinking about architecture, they're thinking about economics. They're thinking about social justice. They're asking a different set of questions because they're using a really, really different lens. And
I think so.
But I also worry about, we're certainly seeing this, I mean, in the World Oregon world, we work a lot with the State Department, and seeing people who are invested in, a career of public diplomacy being turned away from it. So educating the next generation of leaders and design-build activists, are you seeing a shift in their thinking? Are there more people being inspired to go that route as opposed to being the starchitect?
I think so. I mean, okay. So we, yeah. I'm trying to think if it's increasing. Yeah. So anyway, there were 3 of us, and we got this AIA, the Fellows of the American Institute, give this award called the Latrobe Prize, and 3 of us won it, and we used the money we got, like a couple $100,000, to study like the practices of 100 great firms, or firms that we thought were doing good work throughout the world. And then we also took a survey of students throughout the country, and then of firms as well. And we had the AIA run this survey throughout the country, and we found that 67% of all the architects working in firms throughout the country want to have greater social impact with their work. Like, 67% of all the architects working in firms, sometimes just drawing door jamb details, for years, they wanted their work to have a greater, their biggest interest was to have their work have a bigger social impact. They wanted to be more involved in making change, in affecting change, in having their profession become more part of the solution, or being more engaged in that. And I think the firms have started to tap into that in the last decade. They just have started to offer programs to get their students, get their young architects involved, get their thing. We get this public interest design degree. 26 of our graduates over the last 10 years have come, our junior designers, including Scott Mooney, who's now a big designer, has designed several major buildings in the city, all got their PID degree. So we're getting a lot of them, people coming through who are now like mid-career people. When we get people coming from other countries, it's not just U.S. people. We had this relationship with Kengo Kuma, is this god of architecture in Japan. 3 of his people on his staff came and did their degree with us, spent a year here. So it's a growing movement, realizing that we are facing a complex world, and architects care. I mean, we're just like social animals by nature, most of us. You know, there's some weirdos, but and that and that we are and that we sometimes don't have the skills. We want to have those skills, and firms are appreciating those architects coming back and saying, okay, next time we do a housing program, I can tell you how we're going to tackle it. Or things like that. Or I have learned some lessons.
We had some questions back here. Edward, or yeah.
Sorry, I can take so much time.
So I have a statistical question about the U.S., what you think. We've heard two wonderful stories here tonight about you and the mayor of Beaverton with these wonderful things that are happening locally, okay? I mean, what's your sense? If you could travel all over the United States and take a good sample of things that are happening, are there wonderful local things happening all over the United States that we don't know about, or is this pretty rare?
Yeah. Ooh. So we have this, like 8 years ago, we decided to string together firms throughout the world that were interested in created a network called Design for the Common Good. We couldn't figure out what to call it. And it strung together the Pacific Rim network, which is across the Pacific, a lot of Asian schools and some of along the coast of the United States, and the SEED, which is a big network for social change in North America, and the Live Network in Europe. And anyway, we strung these 5 networks together, and we started like saying, bring your projects. We're going to have a conference every year, bring your projects, and projects started coming in from all over the world, and oh my God, they're amazing. I mean, I could spend the next 2 weeks just telling you about my favorite ones. They're just, each one is humbling. I mean, I feel like I've been doing this work, it took me a long time, and projects that I've seen are just like, are extraordinary. So ideas, good ideas, and intentions are happening. I was just in North Carolina, actually North and South Carolina, in a lecture tour, and I thought, oh God, I'm going to be crucified in one of these towns. And it turned out in South Carolina, I ran into a community that was doing extraordinary work to include the aging community, to keep people aging in place. You know, helping people, creating a design corporation within the town, they incorporated as a nonprofit, which allowed, they got design services to convert their homes so they could become renters in their home and sell the equity of the house to someone outside, so that somebody who's aging in place would get maybe $500,000, and they would be renting from the new owners, but they have the little cottage, and then they would have this money in the bank, you know, from the thing. So it came from something else. So this is South Carolina, you know, 70%, 80% Republican? I don't know. It's off the chart amount. So there's, I think human concerns are universal, I find, despite that. I can have a good conversation with somebody in Mississippi who did a lot of work after Katrina, and I had some of my most profound conversations, as long as we didn't talk politics. And sometimes it's you know, unless we were very drunk, and then we would talk politics.
Is there a question over there?
I do. I thought your statistic that you mentioned, that 67% of architects working in various firms wanted to do work that would have some social impact or have some social impact. That's similar in many ways to the law profession. Lots of lawyers also want to do work which will have a social impact, as you probably know. I practiced law in the East Coast for many years, and in at least one of the jurisdictions I practiced in, there was a program that required lawyers to do a certain amount of pro bono work, and this is sort of built into the fabric of many law firms in the profession, as maybe a lot of people have read in the context of the current administration's war on law firms. I guess my question is there any sort of pro bono program or structure for architectural firms, architects?
There are programs which, there's a bunch of programs throughout the country. There's the 1% solution, which means that every firm dedicates 1% of their gross receipts to pro bono work. So they come up with a number and they say, okay, whoever young here wants to take on an issue, we have $80,000 of work, at the end of the year that you can devote to anything you want in the community. And that inspires young people. There's like 3 overlapping public architecture out of San Francisco, connects firms with projects in need. Architecture for Humanity, that's the same thing. They
Architects Without Borders.
Architects Without Borders. So they have all these. There's several organizations that can connect you with, projects in need. What's interesting is that I don't want to sound like we're stars. Actually, architecture was the laggard in the social conscience movement. Lawyers, doctors, they were way ahead of us. Mm-hmm. When we were starting public design, I looked at this Wikipedia thing, and I thought, oh, it's a pioneer in the public design. I said, that's such a bad testament, because I'm like 2 generations behind what lawyers were doing and doctors were doing. Lawyers and doctors and even engineers were ahead of us, because, beginning to serve public needs and things like that. And so we've been the last. And so when we started out, and I was at University of Washington, I actually went to the medical school and I said, teach me, how do you get your doctors out in the community serving? How do you make it work? What are the protocols? How do you choose the students that are going to go out there? And for a while, we did clinics all over, just because I wanted my students to be with their students, and we learned other protocols. Just kind of, and my brother is a human rights lawyer. He's a professor at American University in Law, and he does the same thing I do, but in the law field. And I go look at him and I say, oh my God, you have so many skill sets I don't have, So I'm always, a lot of exchange between disciplines has become really a powerful tool, where we are often appealing to lawyers to help us with the housing model, et cetera. And so we're beginning to talk to each other, which is making powerful alliances and working groups. So.
Questions back there?
Well, you presented 2 very inspiring projects in Sonoran Desert and in Portland. And something I noticed that you didn't talk about was how the construction was actually done of the pods in Portland. And one of the things I found so remarkable and inspiring in the Sonoran Desert is actually using the people who are going to use the housing, involve them in construction. And I know we've very different cultures there.
Yeah.
We have a ways to go in mutualism here in the States, but can you speak to whether or not you tried to involve folks in construction? What are the pros, cons?
Yeah. I mean, you've hit upon one of the biggest challenges. Yeah. It's in Mexico, as in much of the developing world, and even Italy, it's not unusual for people to self-build their homes, to have a process, a methodology. And after World War II, like Italy, offered families all the materials and bricks and things like that if they built their own homes. And actually 60% of all the housing post-World War II, the reconstruction, was built by families, because everybody had some masonry skill and ended up building those beautiful villages that we now want to all move to. So it's kind of like we've had both marginalized it through maybe codes and regulations, and because we don't have a generalized, we've become more specialized and less connected to making. And when I first came to this country, I love popular mechanics. I thought, wow, what a great magazine. We don't have that in South America. How you can do anything, and. But I think we've moved away from it. That's a tragedy, about not being able to. So what we do in the homeless villages is often the people who are coming off the street are just such bad states. Like the veterans, we couldn't ask anything of them. Right now, we have a program with Oregon State University where they are gardening. They are changing their whole site there in Clackamas into native seed species forest, oak savanna type forest system, ecosystem. And they're learning about the ecosystem and healing and growing their own food. We couldn't ask them to build. They were just not. The villages that we learned from, things like that, we involved some of them in a village that we built. We have 2 villages in St. John's, one of the villages in St. John's, were involved. And then, but when I was in Austin, Texas, we used to take people who were homeless and got them into this Green Builders program that the state funded, which allowed them to get certified as green building contractors. So not just a contractor, but one that knew how to work with, green technologies, sustainability. So they became one step up on the ladder.
Sure. Technical support.
Yeah, technical things. So I had a building plus a little technical stuff. That was a great program, but I tried to pitch it at the state, but I couldn't get any support here. But
I think we're sort of at time. I want to thank Sergio. Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful stuff. And I want to thank Edward for being game. I at the last minute said, I want you to sit up here and maybe talk a little bit. I want to remind folks that the installation is up for a while. We're going to be in this room again on May 7th, talking about a lot of the themes in the show and things that are rolling out here. We'll have Steve Messinetti from Habitat for Humanity. We'll have Azalea Renfield from the Williams Russell CDC, who is extremely inspiring. And we'll have Tyler Bump from Eco Northwest and a potential fourth speaker in the mix. And all of these things, really, if you haven't spent a lot of time with the panels or with the show, come back, look at it again. There's a lot to think about. And I think what Sergio shows us and what the mayor shows us is, as the civil rights slogan goes, we are the ones we've been waiting for, and sometimes we know better how to solve our problems than people coming from without. So thanks for being here.